Hello all. Today is week 3, day 2 of the origin of ideas. So we're continuing on the path of Hume, inquiry concerning human understanding, and now we're delving into Hume's system. So yesterday we dealt with how Hume is going to approach the subject. So Hume is intent on drawing general principles that everyone can agree upon. So this is sort of a fusion of the method of obvious, easy philosophy on the one hand and abstruse philosophy on the other hand. So in explaining how we come to have all of our ideas, this is a pretty broad overarching project. In all, this section is very brief, and my PowerPoint is even more brief than that. So I just want to emphasize that these are crucial points that need to be understood. And so I'll reiterate a little bit, but because this is a recording, I'm not just going to repeat the same things over and over again. So it may be important to watch this one twice, or to otherwise ask questions or review. I'll try to provide some additional materials to help facilitate. So the pivotal distinction is between ideas and impressions. So he sort of begins this talk with the commonsensical observation that everyone would agree that memories are less vivid than the moment in which it happened, right? So you can recall when you fell in love, or when you were scared because you were about to get in a car wreck, or any series of things, and that memory will have some sort of pull, some intensity, some force and vivacity, as Hume likes to say. But of course, it will never be as intense as the moment in which it occurred. And Hume takes this to be a hard distinction, a constant difference between ideas and impressions. So an idea is that which is derived from an impression. So he says idea or thought and impressions are the immediate experience. That's misspelled. Yeah. So in the moment when you are smelling wine or looking at a red rose, that experience, the mental representation, what it's like to see red, or what it feels to smell something, that is an impression. An idea is the afterthought. Maybe a while later you'll think about that wine or that red rose and have some sort of idea about it, but it's only going to be derivative. And so this is the very general claim. All ideas are derived from impressions. And this general claim is going to go a very far way in accounting for a huge range of how we make sense of our world. So we have a wide range of ideas. We have ideas about justice, about God, about tables, cups, and chairs. So all of these things in principle are supposed to be explicable by this simple maxim. All ideas are derived from impressions. And how is this possible? Well, Hume says it's a matter of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing impressions. So take the case of a golden mountain. How do you come to have an idea of a golden mountain? Well, you take your impression of a mountain that you've had before, and you take your idea of a gold color that you have, and you just transpose the sort of gold color on top of the mountain and generate the idea of a golden mountain. And Hume wants to say the same thing as how we have an idea of God. So whereas Descartes would say the way we have an idea of God is because there's a thing with formal reality that grounds the objective reality, which is our idea, Hume will just say, no, we just take the idea of something really loving, of something really powerful, of a man, and make all of these things augmented to the maximum, just as loving and as giant and as um, powerful as you could imagine. And that's where God comes from. It's this idea that we can just augment. So he provides two arguments for this claim. So the first argument is all ideas can be reduced to impressions. So I just very simplified the argument form into a modus ponens, so it's the easiest to deal with. And I just put it as, if all ideas can be accounted for in terms of impressions, all ideas are derived from impressions. All ideas can be accounted for in terms of impressions, so what follows, all ideas are derived from impressions. So this one, Hume sort of has the burden of proof here. So it seems like the project would be somewhat inductive in nature. We would have to go through a large series of ideas. Of course, we couldn't do every single idea we could possibly have, but maybe a sufficient number, some hundreds or thousands of ideas, and show where they came from. And so in many cases, it seems pretty obvious. You know, I'm looking around my room and I see a wide range of books and pens and hats and various other sorts of things. And I can close my eyes and think back and have an idea of those various objects. Now, where did that idea come from? Well, moments ago, I had an impression of this sort of thing. So that explains where the idea comes from. Well, now the problem is going to be, this is a very general claim. So all ideas can be accounted for in terms of impressions. So you might have a little bit more difficulty convincing someone that an idea like justice, fairness, or God can be made sense of in terms of impressions. So you might, so it might have to do some work in terms of justifying that second premise as well. Yeah, so there'll be hard cases that might need to be assessed. Returning to the first premise of argument 1 though, it seems like it's possible to consider alternate explanations. So you might be able to account for all ideas in terms of impressions, but you might also be able to account for all ideas in terms of saying something like Descartes might say about their having formal reality, and that's what grounds their objective reality. If that's a convincing thought, this alternative explanation might take precedence, and you might have reason to think that that's a better explanation. But at least on first glance, this seems to be a pretty convincing story of how ideas come about. It seems like we can take a wide range of ideas about the world that we have and just say, well, yeah, I have that idea because at some point I had an experience of that form. But I think this might be a little bit too strongly phrased, because there's probably cases of an idea like maybe instinctual behaviors or something like that. I don't know if these constitute ideas, so you might have to make sense of what an idea is, but maybe a mother's love towards her young or something like that is a certain sort of idea that doesn't have to have any precedent in experience to exist. It's just something that's basic, innate. And he talks about innate ideas at the very end, but we won't get into that. If this topic interests you and you want to write on it, look into that last paragraph a bit more. So, moving on to the second argument now. The second argument is just basically the flip side of the first argument. And this one says, there can be no idea without an impression. So without a species of sensation, one will never have an idea. So if you've never, if you're colorblind and you've never had the sensation of red or something, you're never going to be able to have an idea of a red thing, because what would you be thinking of? It couldn't be something red because you don't have that experience. So he uses an example that comes off as racist, and that's unfortunate because I don't think what Hume was trying to say was anything about race. After all, he doesn't think there's any innate ideas or differences. It's just a matter of experience. He uses this example of wine and says like a Laplander can't appreciate the relish of wine, but what he's saying is without experience of wine, one cannot have an idea of what wine tastes like. So you can't recall the flavor of wine, the relish of wine, if you've never had an experience of wine. And that's just his claim. So it'd be really strange to think that you could say, yeah, I know what I don't know wines. A Sauvignon tastes like, if you had never, in fact, had that experience. How would you have an idea? So if this is true, that you need the sensation to have an idea, then it seems like ideas must come from impressions, or must be somehow derived or composed or out of impressions. But Hume thinks that there's one counterexample, and this is only a kind of secondary thought. He thinks in general that this argument holds and works. He just has this one interesting case, and I'll talk about it briefly, but know that these are the two main arguments he uses, and that all ideas are derived from impressions, is the central claim that you need to remember. And so you need to remember the distinction between the two, and the relationship between the two, and these arguments, which are pretty straightforward arguments. They're supposed to be commonsensical. But so the one exception is this missing shade of blue that he discussed. And he says, now I ask whether it be possible for him, from his own imagination, to supply this deficiency of a missing color of blue, and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses. I believe there are few, but will be of opinion that he can, and this may serve as proof that the simple ideas are not always in every instance derived from correspondent impressions. So he says there are exceptions, not in every case, not always in every case derived from the correspondent impressions. Though this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing and does not merit that, for it alone should alter our great maxim. So the case is, imagine that you're seeing a spectrum of blue as illustrated here, and you are just missing one individual shade from that spectrum. Hume says that yes, in this specific case, we can in fact have an idea of what this shade would be like without ever actually having seen the shade. And he gives a somewhat sophisticated argument for why this isn't just a case of transposing ideas to make another idea, right? So the other point that you might make to counter Hume is that, look, I have an impression of this color, and I have an impression of this color, and so I have an idea of this, and I have an idea of this, and I just sort of transpose these ideas and come up with an idea of this one. So in a roundabout way, impressions are still the foundation by which I come to this idea of this middle shade. And he has this sophisticated argument for why, if that were the case, then it would be this sort of slippery slope of, then we could, from the most distant of things, come to ideas of new things. Then it seems like you could have an idea of, like, if you've only ever experienced really hot or really cold, you could then experience like perfect temperature just because you've experienced the extremes, and you could transpose them. If this interests you, again, talk to me more about it. But it's one minor exception that Hume acknowledges, that he doesn't think is a big deal. So, as a matter of fact, all ideas are derived from impressions. This, strictly speaking, is false, right? He even admits there's one exception, or at least one exception. So if you find one or two other exceptions, he might be comfortable with that fact. If there start to be more and more exceptions, that could be a problem. So this general principle is close to total, all-encompassing, but it in fact is not so. And then he just says, as a final sort of conclusion to why this matters to us doing philosophy, he says, when we entertain, therefore, any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, we need but inquire from what impression that supposed idea derived. So if it's not clear what is being talked about, right? If somebody's talking about objective and formal reality and you're just like, what is this about? Just ask, what impression did this come from? And if it doesn't seem like it came from any impression, it seems like there's nothing grounding it. You might also ask, this might not make sense. You might criticize Hume here and say, isn't this supposed to be impossible? Like, if it's true that all ideas are derived from impressions, how could I have an idea of a philosophical term if it's not derived from an impression, right? Why would there be this exception at all? So it seems like we wouldn't have jargon that just is to no end or has no idea associated with it, because that's just not something that can happen according to a system. So he might be being a little inconsistent here. So that's that thought. So the key points, just to reiterate since this is a brief one, ideas are derived from impressions. Impressions are always more forceful and vivacious than impressions in every single case, right? So even the most intense memory you'll ever have, the most intense idea you'll ever have, will always be less intense than even the most mundane experience of just looking outside. And the only sorts of exceptions to this might be if you're sort of crazy, is what Hume says. So there's interesting cases where there might be exceptions. You might think that the idea of, say, going to war or something like that in the case of PTSD is so strong that it's stronger than an impression. So that might be an interesting counterexample. But that's the idea. But the idea is that there are no exceptions for Hume. And then there's these two main arguments. All ideas can be reduced to impressions, and no idea can be drawn out without an impression. So there's lots of interesting material to work with and points of objection that you could make, and I left a lot of loose ends for you guys to work out. Since we're getting more into philosophy, you can start to fill in these gaps and it'll give you more to write about. So that was a brief one. Ask any questions if you're confused, but I think Hume on the whole is easier to read than Descartes, so read it twice if you're confused. Alright, thanks, and I'll see you next time.